Hello everyone, this is Dennis Cheng here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. What you just heard was a Taiwanese folk song called Wang Chun Feng. You can find the English title on YouTube. It would be called Spring Breeze. So we recorded this for an online festival. Well, it's actually a festival that happens usually, but because of the pandemic, it will be online again this year. This is Atsushi Takano, the guy who made this guitar, AT Guitars. It's his festival, which is held every July, every summer anyway, in Tochigi Prefecture, which is about like an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours north of Tokyo. So check out his festival. You'll find the links in the description box. So that was myself on rhythm guitar, Zhang Haozheng, an amazing violinist in Taiwan that no one knows, and he's self-taught. He's that incredible. My good friend Immaculée Kumiko on bass, and the legendary Fapi Lafertin on lead guitar. Before we get to the content, as always, these videos that I make for YouTube take quite a lot of time to prepare and to make. You may have noticed that my videos tend to be longer, like some kind of lecture or something. And that's because I like to get into details and explain the context as much as possible. And so this video will be the same. So if you like what I do, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting. Because when you do this, it tells the YouTube algorithm to promote my video. And the more views I get, well, I get to make a little bit of money. Not much, but something actually. So yeah, please. This content is 100% free. And if you want to financially contribute, well, I don't have Patreon, but I run DC Music School, and I also have a SoundSlice course page where I've made lessons for Gypsy jazz and straight ahead jazz. And I also recorded 2 albums recently with Duvet Dunayevsky and Jimmy Rosenberg. So you'll find all the relevant links in the description box. Thank you. So today's video is a topic that I've been meaning to make for several years. I never got the chance to do it because it's a massive topic and it can be a little bit sensitive as well. In this video, I will attempt to explain what Gypsy jazz is, where it comes from, what makes it different from other styles of jazz. And this is a video not just for newcomers, but also people who play the style but maybe don't understand some of the subtle historical context. So basically, when you try to define something, such as Gypsy jazz, we can look at the style from a distance. And so when you're at the supermarket and you hear this kind of rhythm, and maybe a violin or clarinet playing some melody, you probably want to label it Gypsy jazz. And you know what? I would too, because I like to keep things simple. But if you start to look at things a little bit closer in detail and with a greater understanding of historical context, then it's actually much more complicated. And that's what we're going to explore in this video. So as a side note, and also something that I'll address a bit later, one interesting phenomenon that I have noticed is that players who mainly play another style, like be it fusion or straight ahead jazz, but who dabble in Gypsy jazz, are often immediately labeled Gypsy jazz. I wouldn't say for the rest, but like, well, yeah, for the rest of their life, for the rest of their career, and sometimes to the great ire of these musicians. So, for example, my friend Andreas Oberg, it bothered him so much that he had so many videos of him playing Gypsy jazz removed from YouTube, or he had the reference to the term completely removed. He just left some of his favorites online. bothered him so much because he did so many other things. He considers himself to be a straight-ahead jazz player or a smooth jazz player. Well, now he's a pop composer. And another person who often gets irritated with this is Birelli Lagren. After his tremendous success with his band, the Gypsy Project, he had a very difficult time escaping the Gypsy Jazz label. Until that point, though, he had spent most of his career actually playing fusion and straight-ahead jazz. The Gypsy Jazz thing was part of his heritage and his early childhood, but really by the age of 14 or 15, he was already yearning to explore other styles. Another young guitar player who faces such things as well, Antoine Bayer. He gets criticisms from purists sometimes who disagree with his broad musical visions, like, it's so far from the spirit of Gypsy jazz, is what people would say. And even myself, this past year, I haven't really played Gypsy jazz, mainly been playing straight ahead, but people here continue to refer to me as a Gypsy jazz player because they know me from before. Oh yeah, Dennis Chang, the Gypsy jazz player. When I applied to music school a long time ago to be more surrounded by straight ahead jazz playing, I actually got rejected because I had made a name for myself as a Gypsy jazz player, and the jury actually said, we don't have place for that kind of music in our school. Ironically, I didn't want to play Gypsy jazz in music school. I wanted to be more surrounded by straight ahead jazz, but that is what it is. So this topic can be a bit sensitive for numerous reasons, because we will look at certain historical, political, sociological, and cultural aspects. But also because, just like anything, definitions can vary from region to region, from person to person, and definitions can change over time. In the case of this style of music, it certainly has. And in fact, in the English language, the mainstream use of the term Gypsy jazz is fairly recent. As of this date of 2021, maybe it's like less than 20 years old. One other thing is that, unfortunately, due to the corona pandemic, I have not been able to travel for over a year. And I had originally planned to make this video with interviews from relevant people in the community. This is a massive topic that will have to go through many subtopics, but hopefully, if I'm not boring you by the end of this video, you could hopefully have a greater understanding of what this style is, because there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding it, even by people who play this music. And last but not least, I will be doing this in podcast format, so you don't actually have to watch the video, but maybe now and then I'll share some pictures and footage from my personal archives. So where do we even start? Well, let me just introduce myself in case you have no idea who I am. I have been involved with this style of music and community for now just over 20 years, actually. That basically means I'm old. I discovered this music after finishing high school. Not only have I been involved with this music, but I befriended a lot of the key practitioners of this style. I became very close to the community that created the style, the Sinti or Manouche. By the way, I've made many other videos on my channel about who the Sinti are, so I will try not to repeat myself too much, but let's just get started. Simply put, the Sinti or Manouche are the Gypsy people who have been living in the western part of Europe for a number of centuries. They have strong ties to Germany, but have migrated to surrounding countries for various reasons, World War II being quite a big reason. And you mainly find them nowadays in Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Northern Italy, and here and there elsewhere around those areas. Now, one thing to note is that you don't exclusively find just Sinti in these regions. You'll find Roma as well. I'll talk about all this. But basically, for example, the Russian Revolution in the beginning of the 20th century caused the displacement of many people, and a sizable Roma community fled to France around then, like the Demeter family, who are Russian Roma, who have now been in France for a century. And they also play Gypsy jazz, but they have retained certain musical traditions as well from Russia. And now with the recent opening of the borders through the European Union, there are a lot more Roma in these countries as well. And this has led to a stronger desire for the Sinti to campaign to assert their identity as Sinti. Now, when I say they have strong ties to Germany, it means that prior to World War II, Many of them had settled in Germany for quite a while. And even in their language, Romanes, you find traces of German, at least their dialect of Romanes. So, and also in their names, you find surnames like Reinhardt, Winterstein, Weiss, Schmidt, Rosenberg. So then many of you would probably want to associate these names with Ashkenazi Jewish surnames. Now, I'm not an expert on Jewish history, but I think most people would accept that Ashkenazi Jews are the Jewish people who lived in a specific region in Europe that is close to the Rhine River in Western Germany. And of course, at one point they dispersed as well. But definitely nowadays, when people encounter those names like Rosenberg, Winterstein, they associate with Jewish surnames. But where do these surnames come from? Well, actually, based on my investigation, these were names given to people who traditionally did not have surnames as we understand them today. For example, if you look at the Torah, the Jewish holy book, or the Old Testament for Christians, names were always first names, and then they talk about the lineage. For example, even the New Testament, like the first books of Gospels, where they talk about Jesus Christ, you have a huge list of lineage, always going by first name. Abraham was the father of Isaac, who was the father of Jacob, who was the father of so on, was the father, like an entire chapter going through the lineage. Now, I can't say with certainty, but perhaps for some reasons of census, governments started requiring people to have surnames. So the Sinti and the Jewish took on such names, similar names. And we tend to associate these names with Jewish surnames because for the longest time, Gypsy culture just was not known. And well, it still isn't quite known, but I think it's getting better, and hopefully it'll get better. So that actually answers the question. No, actually, those names are not necessarily Jewish surnames. They were just names given to people who traditionally did not use surnames. The next thing I want to talk about is the word gypsy, which can be a very controversial topic. And for reasons of me wanting to be neutral and respectful, I will personally try to avoid using this word to designate the people as much as possible. And from now on in this video, I will try as much as possible to use the terms Sinti or Manouche. I don't want this to be a political video, but I do think it should be addressed. So in recent times, there's been more and more activism and campaigning to make this term a pejorative term. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than it seems. A lot of this activism seems to come from North America, USA, Canada, but it also does exist in Europe. And they campaign to equate this word, well, not all of them, but I guess some of them, they compare it to the N-word to designate Black people. This is very complex, and one would have to delve into the evolution of languages and study how words evolve to become pejorative or politically insensitive. So they want to replace this word with terms like Roma or Romani. And this is where it can become problematic depending on who you ask within the actual community. So the Romani people are a very, very diverse group. Like the natives in North America, you have different cultural identities, different languages, just like almost anywhere. For example, even in China, the word Chinese is very vague, as there are many, many identities, and different regions self-identify in one way or another. And some even reject the Chinese label for political or national reasons. So this is a huge and sensitive topic. The Sinti or Manouche are but one group of gypsies among many. So there you go. I use that word and I'm going to explain why. Because many in the Sinti community reject the word Roma. The word Romani is a little bit more ambiguous, as the term Roma is derived from Romani. But generally, if the Sinti want to be labeled, they would want to be labeled as Sinti. And if there had to be another word, it would be Gypsy. So the rejection of the word Roma does not mean any belief in ethnic or cultural superiority, but a desire to hold on to their choice of self-identification and culture. So even in the Roma or Romani community in Europe, there are some that are actually against the use of the word. It's rather complicated. So, when does a word become pejorative? And one could argue that it's often in the intention, because any word or expression can be made pejorative through the intent. Look at that boy. Look at that woman. It's a lot more complex than that because, as I mentioned, historically, Sinti and Roma have not had the luxury of being historically talked about for example, black culture or Jewish culture. I am actually going to stop here because it opens up another tangent that is way beyond the scope of this video, and I'll leave that to actual scholars, activists, linguists, so on. But the term Romani is also broad, as there are many Romani subgroups out there, each with their own traditions and dialect. I also don't want this video to be a video about who the Roma and Sinti are and where they come from, because it's another huge topic. But I do hope one day that I can involve David Reinhardt, who is the grandson of Django, and who has a deep interest in his family and his people's history. So hopefully one day I can invite him to talk about this. It was actually the plan to do this 2 years ago, but we were never able to meet up after all. So the language of the Romani is called Romanes. Romanes if you want to use English pronunciation. And so Romanes, it actually means in the way of the Romani. So when one speaks Romanes, they speak in the way of the Romani. But for instance, with music, if one plays Romanes, one plays in the Romani way. So the word Romanes to designate the language is actually vague because there are many, many dialects. And the Sinti speak a dialect that is different from others. Now, there are certain common words, but for the most part, they wouldn't be able to have a conversation with each other like Sinti and other Roma. Now, funny enough, the word Romanes is obviously derived from the word Roma. But the Sinti still use that term to designate their language, but actually some will say Manouche. They speak Manouche. And that makes it a little bit more precise, but it's still complicated. You'll see why later. Because it's also an orally transmitted language, the language may vary from region to region, from family to family, and even within the Sinti community. Some words are not used at all in certain regions, for instance. And because the Roma, or Sinti, don't have a country to call their own, they are always living in a host country where generally, especially nowadays, you have to know the local language, while actually pure Romanes among the Sinti might not even exist. Some may have a more extended vocabulary, but there are always borrowed words from the local language. And that's why there's a lot of German loanwords used even in France or the Netherlands or in Italy. And in France, many will adopt French words as well. There are even borrowed words from Slavic languages and Greek. For example, when you count in Romanes, at least the Sinti dialect, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like yek, dui, trin, star, panch, shop, efta, orto, enya. So you have actually these words, some of them are borrowed from these languages. So this made me think a lot. It's a lot like second generation immigrants in North America. So actually my first language is Taiwanese. And that's a huge topic because elsewhere it's called something else. But anyway, my knowledge of the language is rather basic. And myself, when I have to communicate in that language, I often have to borrow words from English or French. And loanwords happen in every language though. So even in Taiwanese, which is actually a dialect from the southeast of China, because they were separated for many generations, the Taiwanese variant, while still mutually intelligible, adopted certain words from Japanese because of Japanese colonial rule in the beginning of the 20th century in Taiwan. So to get really deep into this, you have to really start looking at how languages develop when groups of people are separated from each other for many generations. So for example, the difference between French in France, and actually there are many accents in France, and the French in Quebec where I'm from. Tabarnak. So the identity of what makes a person Sinti or Roma is also very, very, very complex. Obviously, it is highly likely that over the past 1,000 years, there was intermarrying with the local populations. I think this topic would have to be another video. But, I thought about this a lot through the lens of me being born to parents who are from Taiwan. And I thought about this. What makes a person Taiwanese? Is it the ethnicity? Is it the traditions? The language? And it's something that I've been personally exploring for a number of years. And it's not very easy to answer because people will have different ideas. The Aboriginals here in Taiwan, who are actually minorities, they will certainly have their own answer that actually might not please the ethnic majority, the Han Chinese. I am Han Chinese. And within the majority, there are also two broad categories here. You have the people who came to Taiwan before the end of World War II, who had been in Taiwan for many generations, and the people who arrived after. So if I'm not mistaken, at that time it was maybe like 6 or 8 million people after World War II in Taiwan. And the people who arrived after World War II were supporters of the government of China that lost the Civil War. So actually 2 million people showed up suddenly. And those people and their government actually pretty much took over the island and shaped its policies for the generations to come. There was already a difference in traditions and language, for instance. The new government didn't allow the use of the Taiwanese language. So my parents were beaten as kids, and some of my family was on the blacklist for assassination because they were activists. And this is all the reason why my parents had to flee and why I was born in Montreal. But there are also small things, because generally the ethnically Han people who were living in Taiwan before World War II didn't really eat beef. But the ones who arrived after World War II did. And that's where Taiwanese beef noodle soup comes from, if I'm not mistaken. And it's one of the most popular dishes in Taiwan now. Now Taiwan is a population of maybe 23 million. And there was definitely some intermarriage between the two traditions, even though they are ethnically the same. So the Taiwanese identity has changed so much over the years as well for political reasons. It's a really, really complicated topic. So I studied all this because I was actually interested in Sinti identity. Because even within their own community, it is not always clear on how one defines who is Sinti or not. Of course, one's self-identification is generally enough. But some, for instance, will define it in racial terms. But then most have certainly intermarried within the past 1,000 years. So how do we, determine the exact genetic percentage? Some will define it in terms of language, but unfortunately, in most of France, the language is no longer spoken. Some define it in terms of traditional practices. Well, a lot of the younger generation don't practice some of the ultra-conservative practices of the older generation. So things change. And I mentioned all this in this video because it is related to how one would want to define Gypsy jazz. It's to show that definitions vary and evolve over time. Even in the most homogeneous societies, such as Japan, you find different views among people of different generations or even gender. I said I didn't want to talk too much about this sensitive stuff, but I still talked a lot about it because I do feel that it's to talk about the music, you should at least pay some respect to the culture where it came from. And as I said, the Sinti are so very unrepresented in history that I at least want to give some kind of introduction of some sorts. And hopefully you'll be interested to know a little bit more. And if you like this kind of info, let me know in the comments. And hopefully one day when I can travel again, I can interview some interesting people. So about myself and this music. Well, because I have a basic understanding of German and I speak French, I was able to befriend many in the Sinti community. And to me, many in the Sinti community are like a second family. They have treated me so well, and I love my friends. I was also one of the first to teach this music the way they played it in the community. And that's kind of how I made a name for myself in the Gypsy jazz community. So much that I was able to then befriend Sinti in all the regions from Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, France, Italy, etc. I think that as a gajo, which is a term they use to designate non-Sinti or non-Romani, so as a gajo, I think I have one of the most extended networks within the Sinti community. For example, I will often introduce French Sinti to German Sinti, for instance. And I just did so the other day. One French Sinto asked me to introduce him to a German Sinto. So I made the introduction. I've befriended many of them who, have shared a lot about their culture with me. And by the way, there's another term, Haklo, which also means non-Sinti, non-Romani. Gajo actually has another meaning. It can mean peasant. Now, is that pejorative? Well, most Sinti don't actually feel it is. And I'll take their word for it. But again, it depends how it's used. Look at that peasant, I mentioned this in another video, but Sinti is usually the preferred term, but you may have heard the word Manouche. Now again, there can be sociological subtleties, but generally it is the same. The French Sinti may be more likely to refer to themselves as Manouche, but quite honestly, they'll also use the term Sinti. I've even heard the German and Dutch Sinti refer to themselves as Manouche one moment, and then the next sentence they refer to themselves as Sinti. So it's that interchangeable, at least for the vast majority of them. Are there people who might make some actual distinction? Probably. But actually the word Manouche in general Romanes, it means man or human. So outside the Sinti community, if you were to tell a Roma, I'm Manouche, they'll be like, okay. So this style of music called Gypsy jazz. And you may have heard the term jazz manouche as well. Now you know where the term manouche comes from. This spelling is the French spelling, M-A-N-O-U-C-H-E, and it is now widely adopted. But in Romanes, as I said, it's an oral tradition, and the words are spelled however the Sinti wish to spell them, and often according to the phonetic rules of the local language. So that's why actually Django's name was spelled in different ways early in his career. And I think I've heard Django pronounce his name Django. That happens in the Sinti community as well, and especially in the old days. So this one time, a friend of mine asked me if I was a fan of Fishkelly. Like, what? Fishkelly, great guitar player. Never heard of him. Really? I've seen pictures of you and him. They showed me a picture. Feigli. F-I-J-K-E-L-I, because Feigli Prizor is a Dutch Sinto. So in Dutch language, I-J is pronounced I, so Feigli. So most likely it was a Dutch person who had written his name, spelled his name that way, but I've seen it spelled many ways from his family. And even on Facebook, he's adopted a German spelling for his name. So a lot of these names, sometimes they'll slightly change in pronunciation due to the migration to another country, and over generations the family adopts more and more of the local language. So just the same with me. In English I go by Dennis, but actually in French it's Denis. And that was the name that was given to me by my parents because my dad was a huge Francophile. In France, the name Reinhardt sometimes is pronounced Renard. So there's actually a musician, a Manouche musician called Raphaël Faïs. But he spells his name F-A-Y-S. But actually that French spelling is an approximation of the German name Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. In France, I've also seen that name spelled V-E-E-S, Weiss, like the guitarist Eugène Weiss who played with Django. So these how the words, how the pronunciation slightly changes because you start to spell them differently. Okay, so when I started this style of music, it wasn't so standardized. People called it different things. They called it Django style, jazz manouche, gypsy jazz, gypsy swing, hot club style, hot swing, and even in the Sinti community, some would say Django style. And I remember my first time in the Dutch Sinti camps, a lot of them were referring to it as Django style. Back in those days, I also remember having a lot of difficulty explaining to general audiences what kind of music I played, no matter what term I used. Jazz Manouche? What? What's that? Gypsy jazz? What? Django? Huh? Nowadays, I think every semi-serious guitarist has probably heard the term gypsy jazz. I think the internet and YouTube are to thank for that. Certain videos have gone viral, and for better or for worse, people now call it gypsy jazz. And I remember when I made DVDs for a company called Hyper Hit Media back, I think in 2006 or 2007, the term wasn't so standardized yet. And so we called it Jazz Manouche, the Art of Rhythm. We were trying to think of a name, and I don't remember if gypsy jazz came out. It must have, but we settled for Jazz Manouche. Nowadays, though, I probably would have chosen gypsy jazz because it yields more results. Is the term gypsy jazz problematic? I think some scholars and activists who campaign to make the term gypsy pejorative have agreed that the term gypsy jazz to designate this style, while not necessarily ideal, is not necessarily pejorative. Now, I don't want to get into this debate, but I just wanted to mention that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of labels. I don't like them. And I actually feel that most people in the world who are not Sinti are not even playing gypsy jazz anyway. Ooh. And even within the Sinti community, some people will say that some Sinti don't play gypsy jazz. Ooh. For instance, Dorado Schmidt, one of the most famous players in the style, openly says that one of his sons, Bronson, can't play gypsy jazz and that he's meant to play straight ahead jazz. I've heard him say that to him so many times, and I was there, I witnessed it. It's like, my son, you shouldn't play this style of music. You have to play electric guitar. He said that in French. So some French Sinti, for example, are not fans of the Dutch Sinti style. Their reason is because it's not gypsy enough. That's their words. And funny enough, some Dutch players, Sinti players, have said that the French Sinti players were too gypsy. Again, their words. I actually understand where they're all coming from. So you see, even within the community, there are disagreements. But as someone who has spent time with a lot of the musicians from all the different regions, I've learned to hear certain tendencies, certain accents that makes me say that most people in the world who are not Manouche aren't really playing gypsy jazz anyway. But let me be clear, because actually, if we look at things from a distance, the definition of gypsy jazz, they all play gypsy jazz. Django plays gypsy jazz. But it's me looking at things with a greater understanding of the historical context. Actually, I want to tell you a story. In Taiwan, after a gig one time, there was gypsy jazz being played on Spotify. And I had no idea who it was, but I immediately said, well, these guys aren't Sinti. They are most likely French. I said that in Chinese. The people kind of thought I was joking, but I was quite serious, and I turned out to be right. There are certain things that I've come to expect from spending so much time with the Sinti community. The way the notes are played, the way the songs are played, the way the chords are played, the rhythm, the arrangements, the phrasing, the tone, etc. Most people don't really play gypsy jazz according to this knowledge. And the same goes for me. I don't always play gypsy jazz either. It really depends. But it's also hard to define. You know, like as someone who doesn't like labels, I don't even have a solid dictionary definition of the style. And in the course of this video, I'll explain why. But because of certain things that I expect from having spent so much time with Sinti musicians, I can tell who has spent time with them and who hasn't. Just like any French speaker can tell if someone is from Quebec or from the south of France, like Marseille. It's this accent that you can only recognize if you've spent enough time immersed in it. Again, I hate labels, and a lot of these terms present numerous problems based on semantics. So let's start with the term Django style. Let's talk about Django Reinhardt. Django Reinhardt was a Sinto, or Manouche, whose family was mainly based in France. But he was born in Belgium because at the time his family was on the road. Django grew up in a very special era. I think it's a unique set of circumstances that led to what we have today. Django was no doubt a unique talent, the likes of Mozart or Bach, but he was also in a unique environment that was the early 20th century Paris. Had he been raised in, say, Austria, things might have turned out quite differently. And it's possible because his family did travel and some of his ancestors were from Austria. So early 20th century Paris and the roaring 20s, the history of America even, all of these played a role in creating gypsy jazz. A lot of black musicians from America spent time in Paris, and some decided to live there because they were actually appreciated there and didn't face the persecution that they faced back home. Early 20th century Paris, a hub for the arts in general, one of the capitals of classical music, which was a huge influence on Django's musical development. So Django grew up playing the violin and banjo. He came from a family of performers. And this is a story that I feel his grandson David should tell, so I'll keep it short for now. But before that, what is gypsy music? This is one of the biggest misconceptions about Sinti and Roma. People say that Django mixed American jazz with gypsy music. It depends how you define it. It's a very complex term, and one would have to look at the sociological history of the Sinti and Roma. Well, persecuted people often have difficulty fitting in, and it's also difficult when culturally your people are always on the road, going from place to place. So to make money, you have to do things that are compatible with your way of life. So one thing they got good at was music, and they played instruments that were relatively easy to carry around. Violin, accordion, banjo, guitar. In the early 20th century, the banjo was still very popular. Some, of course, played piano as well. Not everyone is the same. Some Roma people, Sinti, traveled far less or may have even permanently settled in one place. So, if you want to make money playing music, you have to stand out. Culturally, they developed ways to perform that would impress audiences. So from a musical perspective, they developed virtuosity, flashiness, playing and singing with confidence. They played whatever the people wanted to hear, which would depend greatly on where they're from. So in France, in those days, you had the popular classical music, waltzes from Strauss, for instance, anything that was popular, lots of dance music. And since many Sinti musicians had spent some time in Hungary, or what was then Bohemia, there were also little melodies that they had retained from those regions as well. Perhaps even some stuff from Spain as well. Because they played music people wanted to hear, they often had to learn the popular music of each country. So for example, the Hungarian Roma became associated with music from Hungary. And now, to simplify things, people say, oh, I play Hungarian gypsy music, but it's actually Hungarian music. And actually, there's a very interesting history behind that, and it's really fascinating. I hope one day I can interview someone to explain this history. Just like in Spain, the Romani community, the Gitanos, they came to be associated with flamenco. So for me, especially in those days, gypsy music is not a style per se, but an attitude and a way of playing to captivate people's attention. So in that sense, yes, Django certainly mixed jazz with gypsy music. And there's a very interesting anecdote. There's a quote from the Argentinian guitarist Oscar Aleman, where they apparently had an argument one time. Django told Oscar that, he told him something along the lines that jazz music was great and that jazz music was real gypsy music. Ooh. Of course, we don't have any more details than that, but I would assume that he was using my definition. It has this energy and attitude that captivated him. And Oscar Aleman himself complained that Django used too many quote-unquote gypsy tricks. He didn't explain what he meant, but I would assume it was a lot of these flashy and unorthodox things and the shredding that Django did. So it could be little tricks, maybe like this, that Django did, or like, this is not easy to do on the guitar, by the way, try it out. Or maybe a little flashy, like pseudo-chromatic scale. Stuff like that. So Django was out playing in the streets from a very early age, and he managed to make a name for himself as an accompanist. So he got hired to accompany singers, accordionists, all that stuff. And then there's the famous story of his caravan catching fire, and that left his left hand disfigured. Basically, the two little fingers were somewhat fused and had very limited motion. So he mainly played lead with two fingers, these two fingers, but was somehow able to position his fingers and his thumb to make different chords. So he was still able to do even stuff like this. He also uses paralyzed fingers for octaves. It was around this time that he discovered Louis Armstrong, and the story goes that he fell in love with it, and that's what he wanted to play. Django was a musical sponge, and he had the kind of perfect pitch that so very few have, so he was able to assimilate a lot of what he heard very naturally and fairly easily. He was also very lucky that a lot of American musicians were going to Paris, so he had first-hand access to it as well. He was also very fond of classical music. Debussy, Ravel, Fauré, a lot of these impressionist composers who were popular in those days greatly influenced him as well. So that's why his environment played a big role. What eventually happened was that he had these gigs at a hotel with other musicians. And during the breaks, they would jam on some jazz. And that was the first version of the famous Hot Club Quintet of France. It actually was a quartet. So at the hotel, there was the bassist Louis Vola, the violinist Stéphane Grappelli, the guitarist Roger Chaput. And actually, there's an interview with Roger Chaput, so Rogerchaput. There's this interview with him that was recently released, and I suggest you watch that on YouTube for more details. But essentially, this was the first version of the famous band. And I think it was just by circumstance that it was a string-only band. And one very interesting to note is that Django was the only cinto in the group. By the way, cinto, I've been using that term. Cinto is the masculine singular of cinti. Cinti is plural, cinto. Anyway, apparently Django complained that when Grappelli soloed, he had 2 rhythm guitars, and he felt that he should have 2 himself. So he brought along his little brother, Joseph. So now you have 2 cinti musicians in the quintet. So yeah, it was certainly a special band with high-level musicians, but they weren't the first to play jazz with only stringed instruments. Actually, the violin, just like the clarinet, were very popular in the early history of jazz in America. It goes back to what I said. Things change. Things evolve. Because nowadays, we mainly associate jazz with piano, sax, trumpet. But in the early days, there was quite a great variety of instruments. And the violin and clarinet were featured fairly prominently. On the topic of guitar and violin, check out the recordings of Eddie Lang with Joe Venuti, pretty much playing what Django and the Hot Club would eventually do. There were also, there was the Mills Brothers, a vocal group that featured a lot of rhythm guitar, just like the Hot Club did, and they imitated the other instruments with their voices. It's a very cool band that you check out, the Mills Brothers. So earlier in this video, I talked about looking at things from a distance. That gypsy jazz track at the supermarket maybe isn't necessarily gypsy jazz, is it? Because if it is, then so were the Mills Brothers, so were Eddie Lang and Joe Venuti, so was Charlie Parker when he recorded with the guitarist Etheridge Ware. When they're playing Cherokee, the guitarist is doing that kind of rhythm. Anyone that played this kind of rhythm guitar would be gypsy jazz, wouldn't it? That is, if you chose to define it that way. Or does it exclusively have to be stringed instruments? Well, that definition falls short because the first version of the Hot Club was just that, but afterwards they had drums and clarinet, and then Django outside of the Hot Club played with so many different kinds of configurations. And what about actual gypsy jazz musicians who play with standard drums, bass, and piano? No rhythm guitar whatsoever. Is it still gypsy jazz just because they played gypsy jazz in the past? I'm talking about players like Rocky Gresset, Noé Reinhardt, who've done a lot of work with straight ahead, like actual jazz musicians. Is it gypsy jazz because they play gypsy guitars? But then what if they played archtop guitars and nylon strings? Because there are a lot of gypsy guitarists who do play these kinds of instruments. Let's talk about gypsy guitars. If Django had played Gibson acoustic guitars, we'd be calling Gibson guitars gypsy guitars today. That's how strange things are. The Selmer design, this gypsy jazz design that he played, was not originally designed for what Django was doing. They were just guitars that Django played and liked, and he got to be associated with a company, so there was some sort of endorsement deal. But Django played different kinds of guitars as well. You can see pictures, Remember also that in those days, guitar designs were still being worked on, and we didn't have all the standardized designs that we have today. So these Selmer style guitars were the design that people were experimenting with in France. And Mario Macaferri having created the Macaferri guitar, and then the Selmer developing it some more. But then you have all these Franco-Sicilian luthiers doing their thing as well. So I'm not an expert on the history of this, so I'd rather stop here. But I just want to point out how strange it is that just because he played this type of guitar, now we call it gypsy guitars. But for many decades, these guitars that we now automatically call gypsy guitars were luxury instruments. Not everyone could afford one. And even in the Sinti community, many played on whatever they could get their hands on. Even in Django's actual family, some of his descendants didn't own their own guitar. They had to borrow a cheap classical guitar from an uncle or a cousin. Paulus Schaefer, a Dutch gypsy jazz guitarist, recorded his first album with his cousin on some really cheap archtop guitars. Because that's what they had. That's what they could afford at the time. This is way before the massive explosion of the style in the 2000s. That's when companies started mass producing these instruments, and that's where a lot of luthiers started to build these instruments. And that's also when the term gypsy jazz started becoming mainstream. It's all very recent. So going back to Django then, when they recorded the Hot Club Band, the label that recorded them hesitated. Now, Eddie Lang had done stuff like that before, but the label wasn't sure if it would be commercially viable, especially in Paris when you had all the American musicians doing the typical thing, sax, clarinet, drums, piano. Well, history eventually showed that the band was a success. But keep in mind, however, that Django wasn't just limited to this string formation. He played and recorded with musicians like Rex Stewart, Coleman Hawkins. He played with American musicians. He did gigs and recordings in various configurations. He was an actual jazz musician active in the Paris jazz scene. This in stark contrast with gypsy jazz today, where for the most part musicians are separate from the regular jazz scene. There are so many reasons for this, because gypsy jazz musicians tend to play in the hot club all strings formation with rhythm guitar and no drums. They tend to play songs that no one plays anymore today, playing them in keys like D, G, and A. And also culturally, this is a style of music that is not taught in schools, which is why I got rejected. So people had to make their own separate fringe community. And I'm talking about people who are not in the Sinti communities, like regular gypsy jazz players who aren't Sinti. But within the Sinti community, we have to look at the sociological conditions of the time. Django came from a persecuted community that was looked down on, but he rose to success and fame. A lot of people in the Sinti community saw that and they wanted to be like him. And so they started learning the same stuff that he was doing. But many of them still only played within their own community. There are, of course, exceptions. But that's a big difference already from Django, who was heavily immersed with the vibrant Paris jazz scene. So when you have these Sinti who mainly play within the family and they pass the songs down from generation to generation, song titles get forgotten, or songs become folk songs and becomes their folk music. Some have no idea that songs like All of Me came from America. They think it's gypsy folk music. So that little bubble exists. It originally definitely started with Django, and they did incorporate so many elements from Django's playing, but from generation to generation, it evolved into their own folk music. I hope he doesn't mind that I share this, but sometimes even Sinti will message me to ask me the name of the song because the songs are just passed down from generation to generation. So here's Paulus Schaefer doing just that, asking me the name of this song.
Dennis, gij moet op Paulus, hè? Brinjetu kuigiri kaya. Ta ta para ta ta para ta to do da do 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 Hakagel ko ya ulap von kuigiri.
Let's take a closer look at Django though. He claimed to be a jazz musician, but I think he was more than just that. He was unique. He was like Thelonious Monk, Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, or Miles Davis, who transcended conventions and or genres. As I mentioned earlier, Django was heavily influenced by classical music, and he wrote tunes that may sometimes be considered closer to classical music than jazz. Tunes like Nymphéas, Stockholm, Rythme Futur. He also wrote songs with unusual chord progressions like Spivey. And as far as I know, he's one of the first jazz musicians to write modal music in the mid-1930s with a song called Appel Indirect. So Appel Indirect predates So What by quite a number of years. And it's the same structure, except instead of going from D minor to E flat minor in the B section, it's a C triad to D flat triad. So in the beginning, his playing was heavily influenced by early jazz. And definitely we hear concepts and lines from musicians like his hero Louis Armstrong. But as the years went by, he started to develop his own unique vocabulary based on his own understanding of harmony, all the while continuing to absorb concepts that he had heard in classical music or jazz music. And after World War II, when bebop reached France, he fell in love with it and he embraced it. And then people today, they say, oh yeah, after World War II, Django was playing bebop. I don't think that's entirely accurate. Now this is of course just my opinion, and he certainly played with young musicians who were in that bebop tradition, but his actual playing itself remained uniquely his own. His own language, which certainly had its foundations in early jazz, had evolved into something unlike anything else, similar to Thelonious Monk's unique improvisation style, or Miles Davis's unique language as well. So today in Gypsy jazz, there are people who say, wow, this person plays like Django from the early 30s. And there's one famous guy who embraces the style, and it's my good friend Duvet Dunayevsky. Let's watch a video. If you like what you heard, please buy the album. And then there are players who learned a lot of what Django did in the late 40s, like Philippe Nedjar or Vavao Adler, and they do a really good job coming close to that style. However, I still think it's unfair to say that Duved is a Django clone, which people have said against him. Django is arguably the most famous guitar virtuoso of the early 1930s in the New Orleans jazz style that Louis Armstrong pioneered. And there are not many other guitarists as prolific as Django. Well, there's, for example, Oscar Aleman, who I love. I really love what he did. And for that very specific style, I think his playing was just as legitimate, actually, just my opinion. And we can clearly see the influence of early American jazz musicians in their playing. They each had their own take on it, of course, but I think it's fair to say that it's very similar in style, just maybe not in the finer details. But anyway, Django quickly went on to other things. In that respect, I think Duved is not just a Django clone. He's really into the whole 1920s and 1930s culture, and he's very knowledgeable about these traditions. And furthermore, in his actual guitar playing, he does a lot of things that Django didn't do. He uses all his fingers. He plays certain lines with all his fingers that Django couldn't have played, or at least Django would have to change certain things. For Duved, it was less about copying Django exactly, but absorbing the sound, the language, the phrasing, the intention, the rhythms. And since Django is a huge role model for any guitar player who wanted to play in the early 1930s style, why not take some of his concepts? Because Duved certainly has. Just as Django took from Louis as well. These kinds of lines, the idea of playing like a 4 minor over dominant, the idea of playing a fast tempo but feeling it like at half the tempo. These are all ideas that Louis used before Django. And I know that Duved is not only listening to Django, he's listening to all the musicians from the 20s and 30s and absorbing all the concepts. Just like Django had done back in the day. This style of playing didn't last too long in Django's career though, as by the late 1930s, he was already starting to develop a more personal language. But this early 1930s style that Django played, at least the first few years, that was definitely in the hot jazz style of Louis Armstrong. And I'm using terms very loosely because in those days, people were just playing music. They weren't like crazy with like these semantics. It's not like one day Charlie Parker woke up and told everyone he was playing bebop. And that's actually another interesting topic. I don't have any source for this, but Birelli told me a story once. And I don't know where he heard it himself, but he told me that in the early days, some of the older Sinti didn't approve of some of Django's musical choices. I'm not exactly sure which choices they were referring to be honest, because Django was musically insatiable and incredibly open-minded. And that is very interesting to note because traditionally, Sinti culture tends to be very, very, very conservative. Django was already an anomaly from the get-go. He was going to do his thing and no one was going to stop him. He became famous and suddenly everyone changed their tune and wanted to be like him. So you have this marginalized group and Django gave them a new folk music. And with this new folk music, others were able to have a career in music as well. They play this music in church as well. So there was a movement in those days after roughly around when Django died, where a lot of Sinti became evangelical Christians. And they have this organization called Life and Light, Vie et Lumière in French. So David Reinhardt is part of this movement. And they play gospel music in the Django style. There's a bootleg recording from 1958 of musicians from France playing gospel music in the Django style. So this is just a few years after Django's death. So that's how much he influenced Sinti musical culture. Actually, it's interesting to note that in Sinti culture, when someone passes away, people close to them stop doing things that the person liked. Not everyone practices it, and people may practice it differently, but if I'm not mistaken, Joseph Reinhardt, Django's brother, actually stopped to play for a little bit, for a number of years. The same thing happened when Dorado Schmidt's bass player passed away. He stopped music for a number of years. Anyway, for the greater Sinti community, a lot of musicians continued the music. They weren't all professional musicians. It could have been their hobby and they just had fun with the music. And of course there were actual professional musicians in the community, because as I said, there are always exceptions. And some were even getting to whatever new musical trend there was at the time. Like Django's own son, Babik, never professionally played in any way close to anything resembling his dad's style. He was an electric guitarist who played fusion. David, his son, and Django's grandson followed in similar footsteps. He did his own thing with the electric guitar, but he did have some interest in gypsy jazz, and actually in more recent years, because he's more interested in family history and that kind of thing, he started to explore a lot more of it, but he plays it in his own way. So a few years ago, he asked me to be his partner in creating a music camp, the Reinhardt Family Camp, where he could share family stories as well as teach music. And when I was there helping him out, I saw him teach a solo of his grandfather's. But what I found interesting was that he had developed his own fingerings. He didn't really care how his grandfather might have exactly played it. He was more interested in the general note choice and phrasing. A lot of the Sinti are for the most part self-taught. And you should actually watch my video about that. It goes in detail. But what that means is that they tend to develop things in their own way that might not make theoretical sense, or that one might not expect to hear. And that is often how I can hear when someone is Sinti or not, or if they have spent a lot of time with them. A lot of this is in the rhythm playing. If I hear this, for instance, this A minor, I can tell that they spent a lot of time with the Rosenberg or Schaefer family. If they do this, I can tell they spent quite a bit of time in France, the east of France. This is now, but things might change because of the internet and YouTube. People have access to everything, and there are people like Sam Farthing or Henry Acker doing things from these specific regions in like France, Germany, Netherlands, but back home in the rural USA. And who knows how the style will evolve 10 years from now. Sam Farthing, a young guitar player, I think he's like 18 now. I remember meeting him, I think when he was 12 or 13 years old. Anyway, when he plays rhythm, I wouldn't even be able to tell if he was Sinto or not. So these are very, very interesting times. Stylistic differences based on regions are bound to change. They used to talk about an Alsatian school. So Alsace is a region in the east of France where a lot of Sinti live. They talk about a Dutch school, a German school, but if we investigate each of them closely, it becomes quite complicated. And again, with YouTube and the internet, a lot of things are changing, even within the Sinti community, where people are connected through social media and they're starting to learn from each other. Like this Dutch school that I talked about that is often associated with players like Stokler Rosenberg, Moses Rosenberg, Paul de Schaefer, Feigli Prisor, Repi Corvus, Eddie Grunholz. If you listen to all these players, they all have a very similar style. A lot of phrases from Django, but somewhat played differently, often in a more quantized way with distinct patterns. And I've actually always been interested about the origin of the style. Now, Stoklo no doubt popularized it, but I always wondered how a lot of Dutch Sinti players tended to adopt this licks-based approach. There was a guitar player, Wassel Grunholz, who was a huge influence on Sinti musicians in Holland and even elsewhere, but actually he was more of an arranger and a composer. And then there are Dutch Sinti like Lolo Meyer and Fapi Lafertin who have their own distinct style, and I definitely would not consider their style Dutch school. In the east of France, For instance, in Forbach, you have players like Dorado Schmidt and his sons, Samson, Amati, Bronson. You have all these players like Brady Winterstein, Punch Weiss, Toto Haag, Dylan Weiss, Mike Reinhardt. You hear some common influences, but from very different styles as well. Amati's style is very different from his brother Samson. And Amati is the same generation, roughly the same age as his cousin Brady. They grew up together. They have similar tricks for sure because they learn together, but they have their own distinct style as well. I can tell if it's Brady or it's Amati. Their cousin Punch has a very old school style, like they call that pure old gypsy style. They say in French, à l'ancienne, in the old style. Like a lot of players may have played in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. You have like Toto Haag and Mike Reinhardt, who are electric guitar players and who play straight ahead jazz. But you give them a gypsy guitar and they'll play great gypsy jazz rhythm, but they will solo like a bebop player. Elsewhere in France, around Paris, you have a lot of players who are into straight ahead jazz, like Rocky Gresset or Noé Reinhardt, but you'll find different things for sure. In Germany, especially nowadays, you have something interesting. There are certainly old school gypsy jazz players in the old style, following in the footsteps of Lulu Reinhardt. Lulu Reinhardt is actually from the east of France, but he spent the last part of his life in northwest Germany. But you also have a lot of players who, in my opinion, may be a lot more musically open-minded and who really got into straight ahead jazz. And a lot of them are involved with their local jazz communities. So you have players like Jermaine Landsberger, who's an actual jazz keyboardist, but if you handed him a Django guitar, he would play gypsy jazz on it. There are lots of players playing a wide variety of repertoire that typical gypsy jazz players aren't likely to play. A lot of American jazz standards that go far beyond what Django did, and I think that's very, very cool. I'm a big fan of, for example, Ismail Reinhardt, Giovanni Weiss, Vavau Adler, and there are other young players showing so much promise. So In Germany, a lot of them are playing straight ahead jazz equally as well as gypsy jazz, so it's really, really cool. So this thing about gypsy jazz nowadays is that the repertoire in musical language tend to be so codified. A lot of this is because of the internet and recordings from famous musicians. For example, the tune Bossa Dorada was originally played with an actual jazz configuration, and it was played in E minor. But then the Rosenberg Trio Django-fied it, and they played it in D minor, and now everyone in the world plays it in D minor except for Dorado. Birelli Lagrène himself was a huge trendsetter as well. And other trendsetters eventually were like Adrien Moignard or Sébastien Gignot, who came from the trend that Birelli had set. So it's even interesting is that you have these old songs that Django played that he played quote unquote wrong. I don't know what was the reason, but it doesn't matter. Django played songs like Them Their Eyes or Just One of Those Things, and for one reason or another he changed the harmony. And people played that way in the gypsy jazz style nowadays. And if you were to play these songs with actual jazz musicians in mainstream jazz or trad jazz, it wouldn't work because the chords are way too different. Gypsy jazz players tend to play the songs in the key that a popular version was recorded in. But when Django recorded, he changed keys to suit the nature of the instrumentation. When he recorded Nuage with clarinet, it was in F, but then with Grappelli, it was in G. He was very, very flexible in that way. But nowadays, gypsy jazz players play songs like Coquette in D because Django had recorded in D with Grappelli. If Django played with a clarinetist, he might have recorded it in E flat. So there's a lot of these little things. And as I mentioned early on, since this style isn't taught in institutions, people learn it elsewhere through books, through my DC music school, through community. And right now I'm not talking about the Sinti community anymore, by the way. But among all the jazz styles, it is aesthetically, one could argue that is more aesthetically more approachable than, say, bebop or modern jazz. So it tends to attract more people. And since it's become string-centric, it tends to attract guitarists and violinists. Now, I hope I don't offend anyone, but because you don't learn this in school, there tends to be less competitiveness in the style. That's actually a good thing. But as such, the playing level in general is also fairly low compared to straight-ahead jazz. Yikes, people are going to chew on me for this. There's sometimes no incentive to really want to get better, as generally it's much less intimidating from a community perspective. Of course, there are exceptions. But usually in gypsy jazz jams, I can see people play at a really high level, just as I can see people who barely know what they're doing. Straight-ahead jazz jams tend to be more exclusive, and beginners are often more intimidated, for better or for worse. This is, of course, just a very general blanket statement, and I have seen exceptions as well, but it's just something I tend to have personally observed over the years and having traveled quite a bit. What this then results in is a lot of straight-ahead or modern jazz players may sometimes look down on gypsy jazz players for this reason, among others. So now we're talking about the gypsy jazz community outside the Sinti community. And that is where the term gypsy jazz becomes quite problematic for me if we're looking at it from a close perspective. Again, from a macro perspective, yes, I think it is certainly fine to use the term to market yourself, and I certainly would as well. But if you consider that nowadays, it's quite likely that there are way more non-Sinti gypsy jazz players than there are Sinti players in the whole world. Many of them are playing a slightly different way and having had little to no contact with Sinti players. Is it really right to call it gypsy jazz at the micro level? The tradition is different. The community is different. The way of learning is different. The way of playing is different. For the most part, I hear it right away. But that, of course, might change over time if the world produces more people like Sam Farthing. I also want to be very clear about something. Playing in the Sinti way, and keep in mind that there are many ways within the Sinti way, it doesn't mean that it's better. It's just a sound and accent. And I myself would purposely not play in that way because I have certain visions of music that don't fit with that accent. There's this thing in the Sinti way where they play wrong chords, quote unquote wrong chords, or don't harmonize songs quite right. And that's just how their style goes. It's kind of charming in its own way. But me personally being so huge on harmony, I have a tendency to want to harmonize songs in a more correct way. Of course, not all Sinti play quote-unquote wrong. Some share my vision as well, like Vavao Adler or Fapi Lafertin and Django Reinhardt as well. He was big on harmony. So maybe they themselves are not playing gypsy jazz. So when I first started, it was called many things, as I mentioned earlier. Django style was one of the most popular ones. Again, at the macro level, it seems reasonable, but at the micro level, it falls short again, because what does Django style even mean? Is it taking many of his phrases and parroting them? Or is it the general musical, adventurous spirit that he had? If it was the latter, then Birelli is probably one of the closest to that spirit, as he is constantly searching for new sounds, collaborating with musicians from different communities. But if we're talking about playing Django solos note for note, Stokelo certainly beats Birelli. Then you have players like Angelo Debar, who has never sat down and lifted any Django solos. He only listened, and he had good ears, and absorbed the general sound. And he listened to so much Django, but he created a different style of his own. He doesn't play Django licks. You can hear Django influence, but they're his own phrases. So this leads to a conversation I had with Serge Krief one time. Serge Krief is one of the pioneers of this style from the 80s and 90s. He's based in Paris. He told me stories about this style of music before the explosion in the 21st century. So first of all, there were far, far fewer players playing that style. And since there was no internet and few commercial recordings available, besides what you could get from Django, everyone learned it in their own way and often through an actual community, even though it was a very small community. So Angelo's family had Django Reinhardt vinyls, but he had access to a community of musicians playing this style of music in their own way. Birelli, from the age of 4, locked himself in his bedroom and lifted Django solos all day, but also had access to his family community. So he developed a style that wasn't quite exactly like Django, but it was a mix of all these things and some of that folkloric gypsy jazz from the family. And now what Birelli does today when he plays gypsy jazz is completely different. It's his own thing. So basically, when you check out all these old school players, you can see different lineages and sub-branches coming from Django. But you compare Stokolo, Rosenberg, Rafael Faiz, Moreno, Birelli Lagren from the early 80s, Serge Rief, Chavelo Schmidt, Dorado Schmidt, Fapi Lafatan, Boulou Ferrer, Elios Ferrer, Roman, Angel Debat, etc. And you see that these players all had quite different styles because things weren't so codified and there were far fewer role models. So it becomes more natural to develop a distinctive playing style. One other thing to mention is that Django not only influenced people in his community, but guitarists in general as well. So apparently Joe Pass started with a hot club band. And there are videos of the famous classical guitarist Julian Bream playing hot club style for fun. And he just calls it jazz. In that video, he's playing Django's composition, Viper's Dream. And his playing is actually fairly reminiscent of Django's Spirit from the early 1930s, without necessarily copying Django's exact licks or solos. So is that gypsy jazz as well? Django seemed to enjoy some popularity in the UK as well during his lifetime. And so there were actually players there that were emulating him as well. And on the internet, if you search carefully enough, you can find documents where people talk about Django and they use the term hot club style. So they didn't call it gypsy jazz then. So this is a very long video and I probably should stop soon. But there are many things I didn't talk about. And if you have suggestions or questions, please let me know. I may address them in a future video, but also make sure you watch some of my previous videos where I talk about other things as well. But one thing I hope to do is to eventually involve my friends from the Sinti community so they can share their personal points of view. Remember that one person doesn't speak for an entire community. So I do hope to interview many friends who are involved with this music, and especially Django's grandson. I also didn't talk in detail about playing style, as I think that's another huge topic. But you can already watch some of my previous videos where I do talk a little bit about certain things. There was one video, for example, I talked about playing with 2 fingers. In the playing style, there are a lot of ambiguities that need to be deciphered. People ask, oh, which scales do people use in gypsy jazz? And people will say, oh, it's not about scales, it's about arpeggios, it's about rest stroke picking. Well, I think it's much more complicated than that. And to talk about that would be to talk for another hour or two. I've already hinted at certain things in this video and previous videos though. To conclude this video, you basically see why I'm quite reluctant to use labels. I certainly see their use. And again, at the macro level, I will continue to use the term gypsy jazz because it's the standardized term and it's just an easy way to explain things now that it's a little bit more popular than it used to be. But for politically correct reasons, if someday it becomes popular to call it something else like jazz manouche, yeah, I'll use those terms, no problem. I definitely have my own opinions about language and about terminology, but I'm going to keep them to myself. Let's just say that I will always try to be respectful towards people who are respectful themselves. But at the micro level, the definition is quite complicated, and I don't think it's actually possible to define it in a way that will please everyone. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed the video. Whoop!